Fedor Dostoevsky, Chapter 2. We expect the characters of any Russian novel to reveal traits and display reactions different from American and Western European behavior. Russia's climate and geography, with its enormous contrasts of beauty and barrenness, linked with the dramatically violent history of the country, including the termination of serfdom less than 60 years before the 1917 revolution, had their share in shaping the complex Russian mind. Humor, sadness, and fatalism live close together and shade off almost imperceptibly into religious resignation. Personal happiness easily becomes an all-embracing love for mankind and for the whole of creation. Moral defeat, rage, poverty, humiliation, and exploitations seem to produce bizarre or eccentric as well as indignant and rebellious characters. Many of the works of Chekhov, Turgenev, and Leo Tolstoy are exceptions to this pattern. It is surprising how quickly they establish that easy rapport with the reader that conveys the mood of familiarity with the men and women in their stories and novels. In this respect, Tolstoy is a master. His art of attributing universal human traits to any of his men, women, and children, and of suggesting them with photographic faithfulness and little gestures or remarks, exhibits such deft powers of characterization that they are unforgettable. He achieves the miracle of obliterating time and space between the story's figures and the reader. After a few pages, the men and women in War and Peace become our contemporaries or neighbors. Somehow we are made to feel that we have met them or people like them. That this is also true of Turgenev's stories is more natural because he had become so frankly westernized, as Tchaikovsky was probably Russia's most quote-unquote Western composer. Most of Gogol's characters, odd, ridiculous, or tragic as they are, arouse our sympathies as readily as Dickens' men and women. Chekhov's and Gorky's tales are filled with people hardly more extraordinary than those in any other literature. But Leonid Andreev leads us to that borderland of human psychology where it becomes almost impossible to distinguish between eruptive emotionalism, the eerie mood of insanity, and national traits or impulses that are beyond the grasp of the uninitiated foreigner. His sixth sense for the hidden horrors in man's mind and their impending explosion lends his stories that uncanny air of mystery or catastrophe that we have come to associate with the world of Russian conspirators, anarchists, and criminals. None of Russia's storytellers has fused the contradiction in the Russian mind so inseparably together as Dostoevsky. His characters' penchant for self-analysis makes them no more plausible than their actions. On the contrary, it tends to increase our confusion because it is, again, excessive and disordered. They love to discuss their own psychology loudly and publicly. The beginning of chapter 28 in The Possessed is characterized of the internal mood of all his novels. It says, incidentally, quote, incidentally, they were less speaking than shouting at each other, close quote. Kafka's novels transmit a feeling of abandonment and remoteness between the characters themselves and between their fate and the readers. A sensation quite different from that of Dostoevsky's overheated scenes produce. He loves to crowd us into one room with all kinds of nervous people whose excitement is suffocating. Or he makes us suddenly and without warning the witness of the solitary brooding of a sinner, a jilted lover, a criminal, or a saint. His characters seem at any moment ready to expose their most private affairs and to confess sins and crimes in the self-accusing manner that has caused American observers in our time to be skeptical of the alleged confessions in Iron Curtain countries. The Idiot, chapter 14, contains a fascinating episode in which men and women of high society practice confession as a drawing room pastime. It conveys such an appalling mixture of sophistication, boastfulness, cynicism, and suspicion that it would scare the last ounce of naivete out of the joyful confessor of the Oxford group movement. We have, naturally, to expect in Russian literature a background of poverty, misery, and brutality, but such conditions are by no means the chief concern of the Russians. Their classical writers of the 19th century defied the pattern of Western literature, which pretended to have found the key to man's essence in sociological information. At the time when Dostoevsky was writing his novel, a great deal of European literature was already under the spell of Hippolyte Taine's theory of heredity, environment, and the historic conditions of a time. Parentheses in one word, the circumstances, close parentheses, would always determine man's character and destiny. Or, as Karl Marx put it even more dogmatically, that man is a product of his environment. The naturalism of Balzac, Zola, Flaubert, Maupassant, Hauptmann, Ibsen, and Hamsun supplies ample illustrations for such thinking. Sordid physical conditions and the psychological squalor for the, quote, Zola delight in stinking, close quote, parentheses, Nietzsche, close parentheses, was the outstanding example, are the mark of a great deal of this naturalistic literature. But this does not hold true for most of Russia's literature, and it is especially untrue of Dostoevsky's. The story's setting may be as realistic as that in any of these Western works, but such stage properties remain secondary to the real locale in Dostoevsky's tales, which is always the soul of man. No corner of the Russian psyche remains unvisited. It is the headquarters for all and everything that happens. The soul is the stage for triumph, defeat, and suffering, and all that seems to matter in life is the consideration of what life has done or will do to man's soul. The naturalism of Western European literature was nothing but a first and distant warning signal of the breakdown of society. A moral, corroding, ruling class was doomed to disappear. Dostoevsky took these shocking revelations about man's nature for granted. Man was corrupt, but there was infinitely more to say. He was also capable of greatness and even saintliness. He too paints his social splendor or abject misery, but neither could determine man's character. Some of Dostoevsky's aristocrats have quote-unquote dead-end minds, whereas many of his social outcasts belong to the moral nobility. The astounding confusion between beauty and viciousness in man's interior world is a recurring theme of this quote-unquote morbid Russian novelist. And the oceanic welter of passion and harmony that marks the ebb and flow of his characters arise out of the mysterious something called the human soul. It is more than the battlefield of ambition and desire. It is also the point of intersection where the divine and the human meet in conflict or in harmonious reconciliation. Eternity and time live in the soul in a torturing mood of homesickness. making his favorite characters strangers on earth and filling them with a sense of assurance that is the mark of mystical oneness and brotherhood. Dostoevsky does not employ quote-unquote build-up techniques to describe environment or social conditions. He treats his readers almost rudely by omitting all preliminaries and applying a kind of X-ray technique that confronts them first with man's innermost thoughts without presenting reason and explanation. His characters are naked, quote-unquote naked, people, and many belong to the humiliated and offended, a title given to one of his novels. Like the figures in the gospel, different as they are in every other respect, they appear for all practical purposes unemployed, and we will learn little or nothing about their ways of making a living. There is, to be sure, an occasional remark about poverty or some awkward financial situation, but what really matters are the internal events in their psyche, the internal human condition of friendship, love, hate, suspicion, and tension seem to occupy them more than anything else, and they are forever engaged in this tumultuous business of loving, hating, helping, or destroying themselves and others, in finding or losing life, in rushing headlong into the hell of despair or the heaven of happiness. Gales of resentment sweep over their thoughts and their hectic conversations. They are, moreover, philosophizing sinners, rebels, or sufferers capable of relating their experiences as though they were fascinated onlookers. Dostoevsky's characters are indeed a strange gallery of men and women. There is an innocent prostitute like Sonia Semenovna, a saintly adulteress such as Sonia Andreevna, and the cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church who no longer believes in God. The, quote, lull and deadness of order, close quote, which Dostoevsky dreaded as much as his life, is completely absent in this company. This, quote, lull and deadness of order, close quote, has, as Virginia Woolf once aptly remarked, filled libraries of continental novels and marionettes whose ultimate psychology we are never permitted to know. In Dostoevsky's novels, we are surprised and appalled at the behavior of his men and women whose undisguised inward chaos breaks with the patterns of accepted behavior. They make no secret of the situation, not understood 2 or 3 generations ago when these novels appeared, that the European Revolution had already begun in the hearts of men, and that this chaos was to become a terrible reality in history. This prophetic signal pointed out the shocking fact that our neat distinctions between vice and virtue were inadequate. We see how greatness and viciousness shake man at one and the same time in a moral schizophrenia always known to the Old Testament but not yet discovered by the learned philosophers and psychologists of the second half of the 19th century. It is impossible to predict the moral course of any of Dostoevsky's characters or to know the hidden impulses of their past in a way which psychoanalysis has now revealed. Versilov, in The Possessed, once compared man's interior physiognomy and its lack of permanent identity with the actual portrait of man. He says, for, quote, photography seldom shows real resemblance. That is, of course, quite natural because the original, we ourselves, is seldom the same. The human face rarely expresses its most important trait or its characteristic qualities, close quote. So it is with the soul. As in the gospel, the sinner and not the seemingly perfect man surprise us by emerging as the more attractive character, whereas the virtuous man may unexpectedly reveal himself as a base and despairing weakling. All of Dostoevsky's stories belong to the literature of extreme situations, and ominous restlessness broods over the men and women in his novels. Frequently, their reaction to seemingly small incidents is excessive, and events take a most unexpected turn. The hero in The Dream of a Ridiculous Man contemplates suicide once more after having repeatedly toyed with the idea because he has just treated a child rudely. Stavrogan, a monstrous and infernal character, rapes a child and wants to inflict punishment upon himself worse than death by marrying the half-witted and crippled Lebyadkina. Sonia, the prostitute, at long last saves the murderer Raskolnikov by reading to him the story of Lazarus' resurrection. Alyosha seeks spiritual strength from the saintly elder Zosima before going to Grushenka, whom wants to seduce him, but who instead finds through him her faith in God. Christ's second coming, as envisioned in the classical scene with the Grand Inquisitor, the brothers Karamazov, looks at first like a defeat and mute surrender to the forces of this world, whereas Satan's later appearance in the same novel makes him an interesting, almost pleasant philosopher. The quote-unquote underground man abuses a young prostitute and then spends the rest of the night in preaching to her and moving her to tears of repentance. A mysteriously moody young man in The Possessed takes delight in scandalizing society by biting into the ear of one town's leading official and pulling him by the nose. Though suspicious and deeply hurt, Pavlovich, in The Eternal Husband, cannot resist the strange personal magnetism of his wife's seducer, whom he hates. Captain Lebyadkin, another sinister character in The Possessed, anticipates Nietzsche's advice not to forget the whip when dealing with women, but actually applying a whip to the nervous disorder of his sister in order to, quote-unquote, straighten her out. At the most dramatic moments, these men and women find time for some hectic philosophical or religious discourse, and quantities of psychological dynamite seem to lie ready to explode at any time. Even when a catharsis has occurred, one never knows what will happen next. Versilov becomes ascetic after a wild indulgence in sex and systematically trains his willpower. But he is still far from the humility of a saint, for he enjoys the sense of power over himself which his newly achieved moral strength gives him. It is hard for man to bear even his real strength without abusing it. It is also not for man to define the outreach of his virtuous actions upon the lives of others. The young Zosimov's refusal to fight a duel causes a most respected citizen to confess a murder he committed many years ago. This rise and fall from one moment to the next, this whirlwind of contradictions in one and the same person, and this burning zest for life are apt to produce dizziness in a reader who expects a well-arranged course of action. The reading of Dostoevsky's novel is actually a kind of labor. He leaves us unsettled and confused, yet strangely moved. The men and women of these novels seem figures in a dream pageant, where everything is out of proportion and where some apocalyptic message receives a symbolical twist. Some of Dostoevsky's critics have conveniently lumped together this gallery of impetuous and gloomy people in terms such as Asiatic, or psychopathic. And it is true that the hallucinatory appearance lends them to an air of unreality reminiscent of the weird pictures of the Czech Alfred Hubben. But they appeal nevertheless to our generation in a peculiar manner because we, too, are conscious of the appalling discrepancies in the men and women of our age, discrepancies from which former generations pretended not to know. It is therefore far from accidental that we are today taking such an interest in Dostoevsky, since 80 years ago he foresaw the breakdown of most of Europe's middle-class standards of morality and conduct. Psychoanalysis owes him a lasting debt. It is a curious fact that Freud, the founder of modern psychoanalysis, could not bear to read Dostoevsky's novel in his later years because the divided mind of these characters were so much like those of his patients with whom he had been laboring during the day. In fact, for them and for Dostoevsky's characters, the subconscious mind had become the center of all impulses and decisions. Our modern interest in painters like Kafka, El Greco, Grunewald is related to the exaggerated style of portraying human conditions. Their work, too, appears quote-unquote unnatural and is beautiful only in a higher sense because it opens up new dimensions for conveying the tortures of man's soul. Dostoevsky's novels break the standardized laws of art, which stressed a well-ordered manner of smooth storytelling. He reaches out to the mysteries of fate and God's will. As Kierkegaard had clearly stated before him, the fetish of art and the aesthetic way of life rely on impressions from the outside and contain satanic elements. Art as a cult is invariably a forerunner of moral and cultural decline. The somewhat artificial story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde demands for the reader a similar approach. Beauty and tragedy in human life can be found only in the search for God's will in his creation, where the dark and ugly and the sinful have been assigned a divine, albeit mysterious meaning. A Russian proverb says, quote, "Love me black as I am. When I am white, everyone else will love me," close quote. That is the spirit of the gospel. In this welter of passion, deceit, and sin, Dostoevsky's saints, Prince Mishkin, Alyosha, and Father Zosima evoke our special interest. At first, their innocence seems to deprive them of the dramatic attributes which Dostoevsky's great sinners possess to an extraordinary degree. Our eyes, trained to look for shadows, search in vain for clearly defined contours. These characters are transparent, nothing is hidden, nothing needs to remain secret, and by the same token, little remains hidden to them. Their eyes meet with no obstruction when searching for a man's innermost center. They have a sixth sense for truth and seem to search only for their neighbor's buried ability to rise and achieve resurrection. Mishkin and Alyosha are not the unbearably virtuous type against whom our instinct for honesty rebels. And Father Zosima speaks of his life as a young officer with the candor and humor of which only Russians are capable. Mishkin and Alyosha puzzle their environment because they are disturbing strangeness, because of their disturbing strangeness. Their inward center is not in themselves or in the society, but is part of the divine. There is something supernatural about them. And as soon as their friends feel it,